Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Part 2 webinar this morning on disproportionality in special education. Today's session is going to look at examining disproportionality of special ed students in specifically student discipline matters. We are very proud to have Jennifer Rogendahl with us this morning, and Jennifer is a partner with Fagan, Friedman, and Fulfrost in the Fresno offices. Jennifer is a former educator and a seasoned attorney and presenter. She is very uniquely qualified to assist teams to focus on student-centered solutions to special education disputes and their issues. I am going to go ahead and I am going to unmute Jennifer, and we will welcome you, Jennifer. How are you this morning?
I'm great. Thank you, Kathy. And for those of you that were on the last call, I don't anticipate having any kind of coughing problems this morning. So hopefully we can move forward smoothly through this presentation. Special ed discipline is, as you all know, kind of its own beast. And when we talk about disproportionality relates to special education in general, as we talked about at the first webinar, but the numbers also disaggregate out and look specifically at special education student discipline. So today we're going to talk about defining and identifying disproportionality in student discipline matters, and we're then going to talk about best practices for addressing issues of disproportionality in student discipline matters, specifically early interventions and behavior support, alternatives to discipline, and then the manifestation determination process. Disproportionality is when students with disabilities receive formal discipline at a higher rate than students in the general population. When we talk about formal discipline, we talk about suspension and expulsion. Those are the things that are tracked both by districts and then the California Department of Education, and that information then gets transferred to the U.S. Department of Education in order to look at disproportionality and create the disproportionality numbers for both the state and then nationally. And actually, the Office for Civil Rights and the Office of Special Education Programs, which are both part of the United States Department of Education, estimate that in 2009-2010, which these are the most recent statistics available, 13% of students with disabilities were suspended at least once during that school year compared to 7% of their non-disabled peers. Most troubling is the number that in 2009-2010, 1 in 4 African American students with a disability was suspended at least once. So these are numbers that are troubling to the Office for Civil Rights as well as the Office of Special Education Programming, and the numbers are similar in the state of California, and they're troubling to the California Department of Education as well. It's something that school districts affirmatively, as you know, need to work on, and is something that has been of great interest for both the state and the federal government. As I indicated, both California and the federal government have identified reducing disproportionality of special education students in student discipline matters as a priority. In IDEA 2004 and its implementing regulations, there are important changes addressing the discipline of students with special needs. In 2004, the manifestation determination process changed slightly, as did the use of interim alternative educational settings for special circumstances. In addition, as part of the disproportionality tracking that was in IDEA 2004, student discipline was specifically named, and state departments must now monitor and address disproportionality and notify school districts that are out of compliance. My guess is that several of you that are participating in this teleconference today are on here because you have been told by the California Department of Education that you're out of compliance and that you need to address disproportionality specifically in the area of student discipline. The IDEA requires state departments of education to look at school districts to review data and determine significant disproportionality and whether or not it exists in racial and ethnic makeup of special education programs, and if so, determine if the disproportionality is the result of inappropriate identification for special education, and if so, notify the district and assist them in carrying out improvement activities. And part of this review, as we've talked about, includes a review of student discipline data. Why do we care? What's the harm of disproportionality and improperly disciplining, in a lot of cases, special education students? And the reality is that the reason it matters is that school districts may not be addressing student needs and they may not be providing the right services to a student. When you're opting to suspend or expel a student for behavior problems that may be related to their disability, that is a denial of faith. It's a violation of the law, both procedurally as well as substantively, and can lead to liability for the school district. It's also a problem because students may be denied access to the general education curriculum while they're suspended, and when they're expelled, students may be labeled or stigmatized as bad kids, leading to lower expectations. Student discipline histories may lead to, or students with discipline histories may have low self-esteem and see themselves as bad kids. We also know that when students are suspended, frequently the discipline that is provided in suspending them at school is not reinforced at home. And so the reality is that when students are suspended, in many instances, it proves as an incentive for bad behavior. And as a result, kids continue the behavior in order to be suspended more so that they can be at home and play with people in the neighborhood who are not in school, or watch TV or play video games. And so suspension is not necessarily a deterrent to inappropriate or bad behavior. And that's particularly true when we're dealing with students who have disabilities whose behavior may be a manifestation of their disability. And when we talk about that one particular bullet of districts may not be addressing student needs or may not be providing the right services, I think typically we talk about student behavior being related to a student's disability, and we think about it in a very black and white manner. Does the student have ADHD, and is the student's behavior impulsive, and so it's related to their ADHD? Does the student have an emotional disturbance, and their behavior is related to an emotional disturbance? And frequently, in cases of students with ADHD and emotional disturbances, we say yes, the behavior is related to their disability. However, we frequently overlook issues that aren't quite as obvious. For example, a student who has a learning disability in the area of reading, when we look at their behavior and their behavior problems, they may all stem from the fact that the student's needs in the area of reading are not being adequately addressed through their IEP. And so because reading is very difficult for them, they can escape reading and get out of reading, which is what's difficult and directly related to their disability, by having negative behaviors. And so while it's not obvious that their behavior is related to their disability, it really is related to their disability because they are opting to have negative behavior so that they can get out of the activity that's very difficult for them as a result of their disability. And when we're thinking about students and their disabilities, we need to get out of really the black and white, more obvious manifestation kinds of things and look at the bigger picture with these students. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to some of the proactive things that we can do to address disproportionality in student discipline. The other reasons that it matters, that we care about this, is that disciplining students, those that have higher rates of discipline, tend to have higher dropout rates, and dropout rates are already higher for students with disabilities than they are for the general education population. So adding discipline on top of that, it means that our students with disabilities, particularly those that are disciplined, drop out at a higher rate than their general education peers. And that's really troubling because dropping out of high school definitely can lead to underemployment or unemployment. Those with a high school diploma are 72% more likely to find employment. And for special education students who may not be diploma track but remain in a program from 18 to 22, they can learn all kinds of life and job skills that will allow them to be able to be functioning, productive members of society following their participation in a special education program. And students who are not diploma track, who are disciplined, usually don't participate in any educational program beyond the age of 18 because being in school isn't enjoyable or fun. They don't see the point of it, and they feel like when they come to school, all they do is get in trouble. Or they may be purposely doing it so that they can do other activities, but we really need to be teaching them the value of why it's important to be in school and see if we can instill some of these values in them. Because really, truly, finishing a high school program or finishing an 18 to 22 program can make all the difference in employment later in life. And of course, unemployment can lead to incarceration and dependence on social welfare programs. The other issue is that there can be FAPE and also discrimination claims. The fact that the Office for Civil Rights is looking very closely at disproportionality in student discipline should be significant to everyone who has a disproportionality problem in the area of student discipline. When the Office for Civil Rights is involved in any kind of a complaint, so a parent, when we're talking about disproportionality in special education in general, it's a lot more difficult for a parent to figure out how to formulate a complaint about discrimination that they might make to the Office for Civil Rights. It's a whole lot easier when we talk about student discipline. A parent can very easily write a letter to the Office for Civil Rights and say that because their child is in special education or because their child's in special education and they're African American, the principal at their school site is targeting them, their IEP is not being implemented, their IEP is not appropriate, and as soon as that word discrimination pops into a claim, the Office for Civil Rights is going to pick it up and they're going to do some kind of an investigation. And the thing that is dangerous about having Office for Civil Rights investigations in your school district is when they come in to investigate a problem, while the initial, or come in to investigate a complaint, there may or may not be a basis for the complaint, so there may or may not be a problem. But when they come in to look at and investigate a complaint, they're not limited to just looking at that student. They can actually look systemically at the school site that the student is attending, and they can look systemically at the district. And the types of corrective actions or remedies that they come up with as a result of their investigations frequently are much more significant than those relating to, or those we get from the California Department of Education. It's not usually send out a flyer to remind your staff about this policy. It's usually things like you have to hire an outside agency to come in and do an in-service for a school site staff or for the entire school district or the entire special education staff or the entire administrative staff in a school district. And that means release time, it means money for the in-service. It also frequently includes revision of board policies, which starts to blow this into a much bigger issue than the parent made a complaint about their individual child. While school boards usually are informed about the status of complaints in the district, when the board all of a sudden has to get very actively involved because they are revising and approving revised board policies and talking about changes in procedures district-wide, all of a sudden we're looking at a much bigger issue than the parent made a claim of discrimination about improper discipline of their individual child. It very easily can become a district-wide issue that is investigated as a result of one parent making a complaint about their child. And so that can be really significant for a district and is something that we try to encourage, certainly the districts that we work with, to try to avoid. If you get an Office for Civil Rights complaint, it's something you want to be very, very proactive about working with OCR on and trying to keep the scope of their investigation as limited as possible. You also, as this slide indicates, can run into claims of FAPE, or claims about FAPE, which is a free appropriate public education, which every child who has an IEP and is eligible for special education is entitled to. And the Office for Administrative Hearings, which is the body that hears special education due process hearings, has consistently held that in accordance with federal and state law, disciplining a student solely on the basis of his or her disability is discriminatory conduct that violates both the IDEA and Section 504. And when a student's behavior impedes his or her own learning or the learning of others, the district must take action. And a failure to create, implement, or modify when necessary a behavior support plan is a denial of FAPE. One of the things that I frequently hear is something like, well, this is a speech-only student, and then they're a behavior problem. And the reality is that we need to stop thinking about kids in those, again, not black and white. We need to stop thinking about them in those little boxes, because our obligation is once the student is eligible for special education, meaning they fit into one of the 13 handicapping conditions and they need special education services to benefit from their education, then our obligation is not just to address the issues that relate to the category that happen to get them into special education, but to address all of their areas of educational need. And so if this is a student that has a speech and language impairment, and that's why they're eligible for special education, we obviously are going to address that in their IEP. But if they also have behavior issues, we have an obligation to address the behavior in the IEP as well. That may mean a behavior assessment, it may mean behavior goals, it may mean a behavior support plan. So thinking about children who are eligible for special education in a black and white way really does not work when, especially when we start talking about addressing their needs in the area of discipline and behavior. So how do we, moving from that, prevent the improper discipline of special education students or prevent disproportionality? We need to understand the causes, why these students are in trouble, why the behavior problems exist, understand processes, implement preventative measures, and involve parents and community resources. Because if we don't have buy-in from parents and we don't, in some instances, have support of community resources, where parents are not going to have buy-in and support us, then what we're doing at school is going to make very little difference in the long-term prevention of a student's negative behaviors, particularly if they're repetitive. And I don't know about you, but I know certainly that when I was in school, it was a different time. If I got in trouble, I was afraid to go home to my parents because I knew I was going to be in more trouble at home than I was at school. And certainly I learned when I was teaching that that is no longer the case in most of the homes in our society. And so this issue of involving parents and really getting their buy-in is key in having success in addressing discipline in general for all of our students, but particularly with special education students. So why are special education students disciplined at a disproportionate rate? Disruption of school activities or willfully defying the authority of school personnel ranked as the #1 offense resulting in expulsion. And it probably disaggregates out, although the data that we used to get this statistic didn't say that, it probably also disaggregates out that that is the #1 reason why students are suspended from school. And this is really problematic because students who, with certain disabilities, may exhibit those behaviors as a result of their disability. A student who has ADHD and is impulsive and has difficulty coping with change or difficulty understanding and following rules in the same manner as their non-disabled peers may readily and frequently exhibit behaviors that fall under the definition of disruption of school activities or willfully defying the authority of school personnel. The example I talked about earlier is one we don't think of nearly as commonly, but I think applies just as well. The student who has a specific learning disability in the area of reading, who is really struggling in reading, who doesn't want to be embarrassed by reading out loud next to his peers when he really feels like he can't, and probably can't actually read aloud the same way that his peers do, or who can't function with the general ed curriculum even if he's not being asked to read out loud, may create problems that amount to disruption of school activities or willfully defying the authority of school personnel so that he can escape a reading lesson, so he can escape a social studies lesson, so he can escape a science lesson. And so because teachers don't like to have, and understandably so, I certainly didn't, when I was a teacher, disruption of my classroom, and I didn't like students to be willfully defying my authority, you know, teachers step in, school administrators step in, and they do something about it. The problem is that when we're suspending students for what is ultimately related to their disability, we're disciplining them and we're suspending them for what is related to their disability, and so it's a discriminatory act. And what do we do? I mean, it's really hard. I understand the frustration that everybody feels related to this. Having been in the classroom myself, what do you do to be able to address the needs of these students, not discipline them and discriminate against them as a result of their disability, but still maintain some kind of order in your classroom so that all students can continue to be learning? And I really think that as we talk about strategies for addressing this, we can't look one classroom at a time. We're going to have to look at whole school sites and district-wide and really look at ways that we can work together in order to address these issues, because one teacher is not going to be able to solve all of these problems or take care of issues related to every student's disability in his or her classroom. It becomes very difficult when we're dealing with discipline and we still have to address and teach the other kids that are in our class. And if you have more than one discipline problem in your classroom, it can really become a nightmare for teachers. The year that I had 2/3 boys in my classroom of 34 was a nightmare for me. And I think it was the critical mass of boys, and I'm not trying to discriminate against boys or to offend those of you that are men that are on the line, but just the energy that they all brought to my classroom, it was certainly a year of disruption of school activities and willfully defying the authority of at least this school personnel. And so we need to be able to work with teachers, and I needed a lot of support from my principal and from my teammate 5th grade teachers in order to be able to really be able to address what was going on in my classroom. And as a result of the support that I had that year, I did survive that year, and we didn't have a lot of suspensions and a lot of discipline out of my classroom, but it really took a team approach in order to address this problem. We also still have a lot of stigma related to mental health issues. And so as a result, students who have mental health issues, even students with ADHD, or as I described, a student with a specific learning disability, is seen as just acting out. And while the student with a specific learning disability may be able to control their behavior better than the student with a mental health issue or the student with ADHD, at some point they may not be able to because they are so frustrated by the fact that they don't have correct supports and instruction in the area of reading. And so really looking at the fact that these are not just bad kids. Some of them are, and I will be the first to admit that on some of the cases I work on, we have a real hard time trying to figure out how to address a student's behavior because they are conduct disordered and they come from environments where acting out is absolutely socially acceptable. But those students aside, we find and studies find that mental health issues, ADHD, and not understanding students' disabilities leads to teachers and principals talking about students just acting out and assuming that they can control their behavior when that really isn't the case, and when they aren't being provided correct supports and instruction through the IEP process because, for example, the student is seen as just a speech-only student and the mental health issues and the behavioral issues of the student are not also addressed in their IEP. They don't have correct supports or instruction. Students who've previously been disciplined may be labeled by teachers and staff, giving them little room or incentive to improve. I know all too well what it was like to get that new class list and to go talk to the previous year's teachers and find out what their concerns were about a student, and students definitely carry labels from one year to the next. And that is really difficult for students. It makes it hard for them to overcome and to be able to improve and move forward in their education and not be seen as a discipline problem. Students with academic deficits or poor social skills that are not being addressed may experience anger or frustration or meltdowns at a higher rate than their general education peers. General education teachers may lack the training to properly implement general education accommodations and classroom management techniques. General education teachers may lack training to properly implement a behavior support plan and other components of a student's IEP. As we talked about, parents or caretakers may not buy in to the general education or special education behavior interventions, and so we don't have consistent implementation across settings. It's really hard to implement a behavior support plan at school when the parent doesn't buy into it, and there are no repercussions at home when the district is trying to change a student's behavior, and in essence, they're rewarded for their behavior at home. One of the other issues is that students who are eligible for special education statistically experience bullying and harassment at a higher rate than their non-disabled peers, and what they're doing may be displaying a reactive behavior to bullying or harassment. If we don't know about the bullying or harassment, then we're going to discipline the student for their behavior, and that adds to and helps create our statistics that end up being disproportional for student discipline. So what do we need to do about it? What kinds of interventions? Some of this is the same as what we talked about in relationship to disproportionality in general. We've got to work with our general education staffs on accommodations and classroom management techniques. In the work that I do, I try to get into the classroom as many times as I can, and I can't tell you how many times I've been in a classroom that has just absolutely horrendous classroom management techniques. And I have to say that this does not just apply to general education, but once the student is in special education, we need to make sure that our special education teachers are implementing accommodations and they have good classroom management techniques. I'm working on a series of cases right now where the students are all in special day class primarily as a result of their behavior. And the teacher who presumably chose to be teaching in the type of program that they're in will not tolerate any kind of behaviors in the classroom. And so as a result, these students are all being disciplined at a horrendous rate. We're getting close to the 20-day maximum with every one of the students in this class. And the reality is that the teacher's not implementing these students' IEPs, and he's not utilizing just general classroom management techniques, and they're all in this class in general as a result of their behavior. So it's very problematic when we work with both our general and our special education staff. And so doing some real in-servicing and work on general education accommodations and classroom management techniques. And I know that this is a problem to figure out how to do it, because in the current budget situation, even with the new budget that we have from the governor, one of the things that's gone by the wayside over the years is our in-service days, our release days to be able to do these kinds of things, the days at the beginning of the school year where teachers came back early before students. School districts are still dealing with furlough days, and when you're still dealing with furlough days, how is it that you can do some of this in-servicing? And it may have to be that you in-service and work with and train your principals and make sure that they're really trained, and then the in-servicing and training happens during staff meetings at school sites. You're going to have to, just as you think about students outside of the box when we look at discipline and special education students, you're going to have to look at staff in-services and how to implement some of these interventions with your staffs by thinking outside of the box, because we just don't have the leeway of traditional staff development that we used to have. When a student's behavior impedes his or her learning or the learning of others, the IEP team is required by law. So again, not addressing and looking at what the student's area of disability is, but looking at all of the student's needs related to their education, the IEP team is required by law when the student has a behavior problem that impedes their learning or the learning of others in the class to consider whether or not strategies to respond to behavior supports, and behavior interventions, and of course this may all be the result of behavior assessment, is necessary in order to develop an appropriate IEP for that student. So again, thinking outside of the black and white box to really addressing the entire student and all of their educational needs. The IEP team needs to consider for students who are eligible for special education, is the IEP being properly implemented? Are all of the goals and services, not just the components addressing behavior, being implemented? As I mentioned earlier, a student who has difficulty reading, their behavior may be directly related to that, and if their reading goals and their reading services are not being implemented, if their classroom teacher doesn't understand the accommodations related or the modifications related to reading, if you have one of those general ed teachers that says, I don't allow accommodations or modifications. If the accommodations or modifications are in the IEP, they are bound by the law to implement them, and teachers need to understand that. The Office for Special Education Programming has actually issued an opinion that says that a student's rights under the IDEA trump the rights of teachers that they have under their bargaining agreement. Now, that may result in some kinds of things like when a teacher has to stay after school for an IEP meeting over their contract time, you may have to reimburse them or you may have to pay them per diem for them to do that. But when it comes to things like I have academic freedom and I get to choose whether or not to implement accommodations and modifications, well, generally teachers have a lot of leeway in how they implement curriculum when there are accommodations and modifications in an IEP. Some of that freedom is taken away, and those accommodations and modifications must be implemented by law. And the reality is that a teacher who is not implementing an IEP can be disciplined for insubordination. We don't like to do it as administrators. It doesn't make us look, it doesn't make us popular. But this should be really important for school districts in order to address disproportionality. We need to take this really seriously and make sure that IEPs are being implemented by general ed and by special ed teachers and help them understand the importance of why they need to do this, particularly related to behavior. And they need to understand that it's not just a behavior goal or a behavior support plan and the failure to implement that could result in a student's behavior. Is the IEP providing FAPE? Does the IEP, like we talked about, really address all areas of educational need? Are we listening to parent input about behavior or new diagnoses? Do we need to do new assessments based on the information the parent has provided us? Are we listening to teacher input, including the timing of and settings of the behavior? Is the teacher even giving us that kind of input? And if they're not, and they don't have the ability to do it, are we sending in personnel who can help with that and help with the implementation of the IEP? Are we doing assessment when we need to? Are we doing a functional behavior assessment or a functional analysis assessment to be able to determine, are the behaviors occurring when medication is wearing off? Do they occur in one classroom and not another? If so, is it as a result of the classroom management settings used in one, classroom management strategies used in one setting, or is it because he does better in English than he does in math, or better in math than English? Is the classroom teacher or the classroom itself or the school site administration the reason for the behaviors? Is the student the victim of bullying or harassment? These are all things that we really need to look at and may need to be part of a behavior assessment. The IEP team also needs to consider whether, as I said, additional information is necessary to develop the IEP. Do we need, and to determine appropriate behavior supports? Do we need to be doing more assessment? Should we be doing social emotional assessments? Should we be doing mental health assessments? Should we be looking at occupational therapy and sensory processing assessments? Because the way this student reacts to the classroom environment and processes things from a sensory perspective is the reason why they have behavior problems. Do we need to do other assessments? Speech and language, when we talk about language itself, expressive and receptive language, disabilities in that area are the single largest indicator of later occurring specific learning disabilities. And so we have a student who's eligible for speech and language impairment, and now they're struggling in reading Are we now doing an assessment to look at whether or not they may not just be speech and language impaired, but they may be now have a specific learning disability? Or even if they don't, do they have needs in the area of reading that we should be addressing that are related to their speech and language impairment? Are we getting releases and exchange of information with private medical and mental health providers? Are we getting their information? Are we doing functional behavior assessments? And don't forget that in California, if a student's behavior rises to the level that they are actually injuring themselves or others, or it's that really disruptive behavior of the educational environment, or if their IEP interventions have not worked for a period of time, you are required in California by law to do a functional analysis assessment. And school psychologists hate it when I talk about that, because a functional analysis assessment is a complicated assessment. It takes a lot of time. It's a lot of data collection. And so it takes time on the part of the school psychologist as well as the classroom staff. But the reality is that that information is really important to IEP teams for kids whose behavior we can't get under control through goals, a regular behavior support plan, and through a functional behavior assessment. And we can't overlook the fact that kids in California are entitled to that level of assessment if that's what they need. We also need to, as we already talked about, think about other intervention strategies with our staff, supporting teachers to implement classroom management programs and accommodations, educating general education teachers as to the truth about mental health and other disabilities, and ending stigmas about it, especially now with everything that's been in the news related to all of these school shootings. You know, I know that staffs are being hyper-vigilant about students who, in particular, have mental health disabilities, and your teachers and your principals don't want them on campus if they're a discipline problem, because they're afraid that they're going to become the next school tragedy. And I think that they're right to be concerned about those kinds of things, but the goal should not be, how can we now get this kid off our campus? The goal should be, how can we address this student's needs so that we don't have that fear and concern about having this student on our campus? And it may get to a point where they need another placement. But the initial question is not, how do we get this kid off our campus? The initial question is, how do we address their needs? And then in what setting and placement can those needs be addressed? We need to allow for collaboration between our general and special education teachers, as well as support staff, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, and administration. And you may need to, in some instances, bring in some private providers, people that do behavior intervention services for a living, in order to be able to help you establish a consistent approach and policies and procedures across a school site, across a district, in order to really be able to address behavior. We need to consider the continuum of supports and services. I already talked about classroom accommodations and modifications. Does a student need sensory breaks or objects? Do they need time outs? Do they need preferential seating? Should we be using things like a token economy where they get rewards for good behavior? I know that there are teachers and principals who are really opposed to that, but the reality is that with some students, based on their individual unique needs, we need to provide them some incentive, and once we provide them with incentive, we can fade those incentives off and give them other reasons why they should have good behavior. But it may take a real base level intervention of just flat out, in essence, paying them, although we're not giving them money, we're giving them other little tangible prizes or computer time or whatever it is in order to reward them for their good behavior. And again, I know that some teachers are totally opposed to that, but that is what works with some students. We need to look at IEP goals related to behavior. We need to make sure that that includes baselines and benchmarks, and those goals must be measurable. And again, this is where assessment ties directly into our IEPs. If you're connecting the dots in the IEPs, you go from present levels, which may require assessment in order to get those present levels, to goals, which include IEP plans in the next bullet point, which may be behavior support plans, to goals drive placement and services, and then accommodations and modifications. Individual health plans are also really important and frequently overlooked for kids who have medical problems. And we need to not overlook medication administration. While that is not a part of the IEP, a health plan related to medication administration may be, and that may be a really important thing to be able to partner with parents, with outside doctors, in order to ensure that students are getting the medications they're already prescribed. A medication cannot be a component of an IEP, but an individual health plan and managing a student's health issues, which may include medication administration, absolutely can be. We need to look at IEP Based Services, counseling and mental health support, tutoring or academic support. And I know we don't like to think about tutoring, in essence, as part of an IEP, and I'm not really promoting tutoring in the sense of after-school services, but what I am talking about is thinking about, is this a student who really should be having some pull-out resource time? And what type of academic support do they have? I was in an IEP meeting the other day where the teacher said, we only do push-in services at this school, and I know that as we have moved toward response to intervention and more inclusive education, we're doing more push-in services, and in general for students, that is great, and it helps them, and they're far more successful in a push-in than a pull-out environment. But we have some students on our campus, and frequently they are the ones with behavior problems who feel stigmatized or who don't get enough support by push-in, and they still need pull-out services. So we need to be really careful as we're moving toward these more inclusive programs, that we don't forget that some students still do need pull-out services, and we need to make them available to them if they need them. It doesn't mean you need to have them on every school site. It may mean that some students who need pull-out services need to go to a different school site within the district in order to get those and have an appropriate education, but we still need to be looking at those even in this inclusive environment. Social skills programs and parent training. Do not forget that parent training is actually, under California law, part of the list of related services. Well, Jennifer, how do we provide that? Well, you're going to have to get creative. You know, as we move and shift mental health services from under AB 3632 and really thinking about them as a related service, maybe we're not offering family counseling and therapy anymore because we're not under AB 3632, but maybe what we're offering is parent training, and it may be from our school psychologist, it may be from a school social worker, it may be from the people that we're contracting with in order to provide mental health services. But parent training absolutely is a related service. And it can help us with the low buy-in for behavioral programs at school. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily addressing behavior in the home, but helping parents to understand why consistency actually helps us with the program at school. And other services that we may need to address, for example, the reading problem that's creating the behavior problem, academic support, occupational therapy, speech and language. We need to look at alternatives to suspension. In California, this last July, the law added additional emphasis to alternatives to suspension. And I know particularly with our special ed kids who are real behavior problems, principals like to suspend kids, and they like to suspend them for 5 days of a whack. And that does not do anybody any favors. And it really, in truth, hurts us when it comes to disproportionality. Principals need to be considering alternatives to suspension. Suspension should only be considered where other means of correction have been tried and failed. In addition to traditional IEP services, we can look at alternatives such as school-based discipline, in-school suspension, but be careful because in-school suspension that is just babysitting is really suspension. But in-school suspension where the student still gets their special ed services and access to the general curriculum, and somebody's really still providing them with support, but it's not fun and it's not in the general ed setting and they don't get to go to recess and all of those kinds of things, may be what you need to do in place of sending them home where they get to watch TV and play video games all day. And if it's not used real regularly with a student, you know, they're not being put in school suspension every other day, there are arguments to be made that it doesn't count as a suspension because they still got their services. You have to be really careful about that, that there are arguments that can be made that that doesn't count as a suspension when you use an alternative such as in-school suspension. School service can also be used. Restorative justice, community programs such as mentoring, Big Brothers. In some counties, there are mentoring programs through probation. So kids who are on probation can tap into a mentoring program that can assist with actually discipline problems in the school. I actually had a student in my 5th grade class who was on probation one year, and we got him involved in the probation mentoring program, and it made all the difference in the world in his behavior at school. Anger management and anti-drug programs, parent conferences, peer conflict resolution programs. There are some districts in this state that have amazing peer conflict resolution and peer mentor programs that are used as alternatives to discipline and help students change their behaviors. The reality is suspension really does very little to change a student's behavior. So why is that what we always jump to? And when I talk about alternatives to suspension and don't suspend kids at 5 days at a whack, what I'm talking about is in California, the maximum time that a suspension can take place is 5 days, unless we're talking about expulsion and extended suspension. I'm not talking about that right now. But the maximum number of days that you can suspend a student for one incident is 5 days. But special education law specifically says that discipline can be administered on a case-by-case basis. So they don't have to be suspended for 5 days at a time. Even if they're involved in a fight with a bunch of general ed kids and you're going to suspend all of the general ed kids for 5 days for the incident, why do you have to suspend your special ed student for that number of days? Maybe one is enough to send a message to that student. Maybe one is all you want to do because one of the things you're doing is targeting disproportionality in your district. But the law allows for discrimination and discipline, and special ed students do not have to be disciplined at the same rate as their general education peers. And when parents ask you, how come that kid only got suspended for 1 day and my kid got suspended for 5, the response is, I can't talk to you about any other students. Discipline is handled on a case-by-case basis. I'm not going to talk about your child to any other parents, and I addressed your child and determined the appropriate suspension for your child's behavior in this situation, and I handled all of the other kids that were involved, and they got the same kind of treatment, case-by-case, a determination of how many days that individual child should be disciplined, but I can't give you any more information than that, and you wouldn't want me to give you any more information than that about wouldn't want me to give any other parent any more information than that about your child. When all of the strategies have been tried and failed and discipline is necessary, make sure it is documented. Do not let your staff just send kids home without actually suspending them. If they're being sent home for discipline, they should be suspended. And that is a general education practice. So when we talk about following both general and special education discipline procedures, that's what I mean. One of the questions that came up is, what is the 20-day maximum? And when I talk about that, that's a general education procedure. So when I'm talking about general ed procedures, I'm talking about you actually need to provide parents with notice of suspension. Kids actually need to be suspended if they're being sent home for discipline and not just sent home. The maximum length of a suspension is 5 days. The maximum number of days that any student can be suspended in a school year is 20, whether they're general education or special education. And once you get to 20, you're done. And that's why I say, why would a student be suspended for 5 days at a whack, especially if they are a special education student that has a discipline problem that we know about, because then you're only going to suspend them 4 times in the year, and then you're done. And the law anticipates that you will move on from there to expulsion, and they will go into an expulsion setting, which if they're in that alternative disciplinary setting, you can actually have 10 more days so that you can get to 30 in a year, but the general rule is 20 is the maximum. The other problem is with special education kids, very frequently their behavior is a manifestation of their disability. And so if you get to 20, you're not going to be able to move on to expulsion because their behavior is a manifestation of their disability, and so then you're stuck with them and you have no more days that you can suspend them for. The other problem with special education students is that once we get past 10 days, so once we get to the 11th day of suspension, you can continue to suspend between 11 and 20, but the problem is that once you get to the 11th day, they are entitled to additional protections under the law. The one we all think about is manifestation determination meetings. The one we don't think very much about is that beginning with the 11th day of suspension, they're also entitled to what we call FAPE Light. And that is that they are entitled to services that allow them to continue to progress in the general curriculum and to progress toward their goals and objectives. So we can't just send them home with nothing, and also sending them home with just work to do to make up for the day of suspension is not, in most instances, going to allow that student, special ed student, to progress toward the general curriculum and to allow them to continue to progress toward their goals and objectives. So when we start getting to day 11 with special education students, not only are we creating problems with disproportionality, but they're allowed additional rights. And when we talk about manifestation determination meetings, we got to get a team together within 10 school days of when the discipline happened. We need to consider all kinds of information during the meeting, and we need to ask questions whether or not their behavior was related to their disability or whether or not our failure to implement their IEP was the reason for the disability. And like I said, most teams look at these questions very black and white, and the reality is that when parents challenge these and the district goes to due process over this disciplinary issue, OEH does not look at these black and white. If there were counseling services on the IEP that were designed to address a student's depression, and the reason that they're being disciplined is willful defiance, which is not at all related to depression, the fact that we aren't implementing the counseling services, OEH is going to say that that's the reason the behavior occurred, and you're not going to get to continue to discipline this student. Their behavior was a manifestation of their disability. So if you expelled, they're going to come back into district. So we need to take discipline really seriously and look at alternatives to discipline and be very aware that once we get to the 11th day of suspension, particularly for special ed kids, not only are we looking at disproportionality issues, but we're looking at the fact that they get additional rights. And what's required following a manifestation determination? Well, for our special ed kids, if their behavior is a manifestation of their disability, then the law actually forces us to do some of those interventions that I talked about earlier. You have to conduct a functional behavior assessment and implement a behavior, it says intervention plan in the federal law, but in California that really amounts to a behavior support plan. In federal law, we don't have both BSPs and BIPs. In federal law, they just talk about behavior intervention plans, which in California we have both, the lower behavior support plan and the more difficult behavior intervention plan, which results from a functional analysis assessment. And so the IEP team has to conduct at least a functional behavior assessment and develop a behavior support plan, or they might need to do a functional analysis assessment and a behavior intervention plan in California. And you have to, if they already have one, and have already had a functional behavior assessment, at a minimum, review and revise what they have to address the behavior that occurred. So we have all these protections that come into place for special education students once we get to day 11, on top of the fact that it's creating a real disproportionality problem for us. So the reality is we shouldn't be talking about what to do once we get to manifestation determination stage and day 11. What we should be talking about is what do we do to prevent us even getting to that point. That's how you're going to resolve your disproportionality problem. All the stuff we talked about before now. You've got to put interventions into place related to behavior management and classroom management and working with principals on alternatives to suspension, or you're going to continue to have problems with disproportionality in discipline for special education students. And so that would be my bottom line message of today's webinar. Prevention is the only way that you're going to, you are going to prevent disproportionality when it comes to the discipline of special education students. And so with that, I would like to move on to some of the questions that have been posed. I already talked about the 20-day maximum. That was one of the questions. The next question is whether or not we can get you a copy or a link to the Office of Special Education Programming's opinion about the IDEA and a student's IEP trumping a union contract. And yes, we can get that to you. I will get that to Kathy. And the materials, both the PowerPoint and the this webinar, so my voice, are going to be archived on the Keenan website. And so I will get the link to Kathy for that Office of Special Education Programming advisory and opinion, and we can put that link up with the webinar so that you can access those materials.
Right.
Following
those will be at, those are going to be at www.keenan.com/webinars, and I will put that also into the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kathy. And the last question has to do with the last bullet here, which is return the child to the placement from which the child was removed unless the parent and district agree to a change in placement as part of, oh, I guess it really doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with give examples of an interim alternative educational setting and transition back to school. And that really is a very long question. In special education, for students who commit what I like to call one of the 3 unpardonables, which is drugs, which does not include alcohol because we're talking about federal law and not state law. And while under state law we punish students basically the same way for alcohol as we do for drugs, under the federal law we don't. So when we talk about special education discipline and an interim alternative educational setting placement, we don't include alcohol. It's just drugs. Weapons, and there are some limitations related to things like length of knife and those kinds of things in the definition. I don't have them memorized off the top of my head, similar to what we have in California law. And then the last one is serious bodily injury, which is more than I got a bruise. It really is, you know, significant dismemberment of the body or mental faculty. And so we're talking about, you know, somebody really had to go to the doctor, the emergency room, all of those kinds of things as a result of the physical injury. If a student commits one of those 3 things, then whether their behavior is a manifestation of their disability or not, you can actually move them or change their placement without parental consent for 45 school days and put them into an interim alternative educational setting. An interim alternative educational setting can be really kind of anything, but it has to meet the standard of allowing the student to continue to progress in the general curriculum, so the FAPE Light standard, and allowing them to continue to progress toward the general curriculum. For the parent for the child who you really believe after the manifestation determination meeting and you go through the IEP process that there should be a change in placement and the parent won't consent to that change in placement, the 45 school day IAES could actually be to that change in placement. And the benefit that that gives you is that you can put the kid in that placement. Now the parent has to actually bring them to school and not have them be truant. But you can put them in that placement and show the parent during that 45 school day time period how successful the child can be in the new placement, and hopefully by the end of that time period, the parent will consent to the change in placement and the kid won't actually transition back to your school site. But if during that time period you can't get a parent to agree to a change in placement, then the student after the 45 school days does have the right to come back to your school site. And as far as the transition back is concerned, there's no legal requirement for specific transition activities at the transition back to the school site at the end of the 45 school day IAES, but it's obviously best practice to put some supports in place so that hopefully following the 45 school day IAES, the student is not committing the same kinds of behavior problems that they were prior to putting them in and prior to triggering the 45 school day IAES. So you may want to revise a behavior support plan, add a behavior support plan, put new goals, any number of things related to the student's behavior to help them transition back to their school site after being placed in a 45 school day IAES. So with that, that's all of our questions that I know of. Kathy, do you have any additional questions?
Nope, that's about it. And I do want to remind everybody, I've put up Jennifer's web address on here. And again, you can go on into thekeenan.com/webinars, and the PowerPoint and the recording will be posted there for you to review. Jennifer mentioned a little bit about thinking outside the box for some solutions, and I do want to remind everyone that we have got Keenan Safe Schools that can be taken online at the computer, no time away from work, and it's a viable solution to some of the training constraints that we're seeing now with the budget. That's about it. Thank you so very much, Jennifer. You are so knowledgeable in this area. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great week.